Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our conversation about home ownership in California. My name is David Garcia, and I'm the policy director here at the Terner Center. And if you are not familiar with the center, you should be. So we are a housing research and policy center at UC Berkeley that focuses on all manners of issues regarding housing, from the cost of construction to land use reforms to permanent supportive housing and homelessness. But today, we are here to talk specifically about homeownership, teeing off of a recent report we put together on this topic. So if you're tuning in today, you already know that it's incredibly expensive to own a home in California. There's no surprises there. But how do we compare to the rest of the country? And how have home ownership rates and rates of owning homes free and clear, that is to say without a mortgage, how have those changed over time, and how do those rates look across different demographic groups? And so those are some of the questions that we examined in this recent paper that we will share a link to in the chat. So we have a great conversation lined up, starting first with my colleague, Issy Relman, who is the lead author of the report and the principal of Metro Site. Issy is going to walk through the research findings, which will be the basis for our panel conversation. And I'm very excited about the group we've been able to put together today. All of them have a really incredible practical knowledge and experience in the area of homeownership in California. And so I'll quickly introduce our panel. We're joined by Jeff Schroeder, who runs the single-family home building company Ponderosa Homes, and also serves as the chair of the California Building Industry Association. We also have Ellen Martin, who is the director of homeownership at the California Housing Finance Agency, who oversees their various homeownership programs. And we also have my good friend, Noerena Limón, who is the principal at Mariposa Strategies and one of the leading experts on Latino homeownership, having also worked with organizations such as the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals and Unidos US. So thank you all for joining us. I look forward to this conversation. With just some quick housekeeping. Today's conversation is being recorded. And so the video will be made available in the next week or so after today on our websites. We'll also be taking audience questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And the last thing before we get started is just want to thank the supporters of this work, Meta, who have been great partners on this research and others that we do here at the Terner Center. So thanks again for their support on this topic and on our housing research in general. And with that, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Issy, who's going to walk us through the report findings before we jump into the panel conversation. So Issy, go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, David. I'm going to get us set up here. So I'm Issy Relman. I'm an economist, formerly a fellow at the Terner Center, still an affiliate, and work closely with the center. This is a study that we performed early this year. I'm going to start by showing you some general numbers around homeownership trends. So this chart over here looks at homeownership in California, just the share of 25 to 75-year-olds who own their home compared to the rest of the country. So the light blue here shows homeownership nationally, around 2/3 of households being homeowners, with a substantial drop in the last 2 decades or so. It also shows California being on par with the nation for the last time around 1960, and since then diverging downwards from the rest of the nation. This blip over here in the early 2000s is the housing boom of the mid 2000s. Homeownership rates rose temporarily then, but despite this, there's a long run downward trend in homeownership rates. Today, homeownership around the nation stands at more than half, something like 55, 56, or 7%, depending on the exact year you're looking at. Whereas in California, it's about 47 or 48%, so a good 10 percentage points less, which is a very meaningful difference. If we look at that across age groups, we see that this change in homeownership or the decline is not specific to a particular age group. On the left here, we have 25 to 35-year-olds, and the colors take us from 1980 through 2000 to 2021. And you can see that there's a consistent and large drop in homeownership rates among this 25 to 35-year-olds. There's a similarly large and significant drop among the next age group, 35 to 45-year-olds, which is the key homeownership age, if you will. In an early draft of this paper, we had an example of some homeowners that everybody would recognize who were in this age group. I forget exactly who was there, but I do remember Homer Simpson being one of the names. Homer Simpson is supposedly in his early 40s and has been for several decades now. 45 to 60-year-olds older also saw a significant drop. Only when you get to the 60 to 75-year-olds did different things start happening. And even there, the last 20 years show a non-negligible drop. This earlier chart, sorry, I might have lost you guys here. This chart that I showed a moment ago looks at different age groups over time. This chart looks at different age groups and compares homeownership in California to the rest of the US. So the lighter bars correspond to the US as a whole, and the darker bars are what's happening in the same age group in California. So in California, about half as many people in the 25 to 35-year-old group are homeowners compared to the rest of the nation. This refers to households, not people. I misspoke a moment ago. Among 35 to 45-year-olds, the gap is also significant, and you can see it in all of the age groups. Okay, in other words, this is true both over time and within our current period across the US between California and the rest of the country. This map over here shows something that we call the age of prevalence. The age of prevalence is the youngest age at which more than 50% of household heads are homeowners. And we can see here how it changed from 1980 to the present. So in 1980, it was about 32 in California, jumped to 40, then jumped to 49 in 2021. It's not until you're almost 50 that half of people are homeowners in the state. If you were to watch this closely, you'd see that in 1980, the age of prevalence was higher in New York than it is in California. California has surpassed New York. And you can see that even today, this age, although it has risen across the country, it is not nearly what it is in California. This next chart looks at things by ethnicity. The top left is whites, the top right is blacks. You can see that Black homeownership rates are substantially lower than they are for whites. But what I want you to take away from this chart is not just that, but the fact that this decline for each age group across the three 20-year chunks we're looking at is the same. Okay, in other words, regardless of whether you're white or black or Asian in the bottom left or Hispanic in the bottom right, as you shift from 1980 to 2000 to 2021, you see homeownership rates decline in this way. This is true within groups as well as over time for the general population. This next chart does a similar comparison, this time by life cycle milestones. The two charts on the left look at education levels, college educated people or household heads, and non-college educated household heads. And although you can see that the homeownership rates at the bottom are lower, both charts show a serious decline across the years within each age group. The middle two charts look at whether people are married or unmarried. Household homeownership rates are much higher for married people than they are for unmarried. But within the two groups, you can see, or within each of the groups, you can see this decline over time within each age group. Here on the right, we look at whether there are children in the household. The top right is a chart for households with children at home, the bottom right without children at home. And you can see that within each group, we see the same decline over time. Why is this important? The uniformity of the decline in homeownership across across all the groups, not just age groups, suggests an important role for housing affordability as opposed to just delayed life cycle milestones. What am I getting at here? One could argue that one of the reasons that homeownership is declining in California is that the population is changing. It's growing more educated, perhaps as the industrial mix here changes and skews towards occupations and industries that require education. And you could argue that people who stay in college longer, get married later, have children later, and have less of a reason or less of a need or a want to become homeownerships at the same age, and that perhaps that is what's driving the decline in homeownership. If that were the case, then we would see that within each of these subsets here, we'd basically see a flat line, right? If the reason that people had lower homeownership rates in California has to do with the fact that they're getting married later, then we wouldn't see this decline within the married group for each age group. It would simply be that a bigger share of people was shifting from this group of married people to this group of unmarried people. Similarly, children at home, no children at home. You could argue, of course, that even within the married people, it's the children at home or lack thereof that determine homeownership, and that would require looking at an even finer group. And that gets at the point that what we're showing here is just suggestive. In this study, what we did was go one step further and look at people's ability to afford a home. I'll explain what we did in a moment, but I'll just start by saying that what we actually ought to care about as policymakers isn't necessarily whether or not people become homeowners or not. Because if people don't become homeowners out of choice because they don't want to for some reason, that's actually not a problem. The problem is when people don't become homeowners because they can't afford to. And so this shift from looking not at homeownership rates directly, but rather to the ability to afford a home is one that actually gets closer to the policy element that we ought to care about. So what did we do? We looked at data from all around the country and asked, we used data from something called the SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which has very rich data on people's personal finances. It's a government survey. It's got a broad enough sample to look at California carefully. And what we did was look at households nationwide and asked what was their typical net worth at the point that they chose to buy a home. We did the same thing for free and clear homeownership as well later in life. And using that typical financial state at which people buy homes around the country as a benchmark, we asked what share of households in California have that financial ability per that measure to buy a home, and how is that both changed over time, and how does that compare in California to the rest of the country? This chart here on the left shows the California versus the rest of the country comparison. It basically says at age 25 to 35, 23% of households outside of California in the US have the financial ability to afford a home locally. In California, that's just 15%, substantially lower. Similarly, a lower share in the 35 to 45-year-old age groups and in the older age groups as well. This chart on the right shows what these numbers look like for free and clear homeownership, which has its separate benchmark. This is the key set of findings. So for 25 to 35-year-olds, the difference in homeownership rates between California and the rest of the country was about 15%. The difference in the ability to afford a home was smaller, was about 8%. This 8% is a bit more than half of this 15%. One way of reading this, a simple way, is to say that this means that 52.3%, just over half of the lower homeownership rate in California, has to do with people being less able to afford a home in California. The other, almost 50%, coming from different factors that affect whether or not people choose to buy a home, like going to college later, getting married later, having kids later, and so forth. The same statistic is about 50% in the next age group, and it gets higher as you reach these older age groups. A population-weighted average puts the role of affordability at 55.6%. In other words, more than half of the difference in homeownership between California and the rest of the country has to do with being unable financially to afford a home in California. Last slide, we ran some scenarios. What would have happened to the decline in homeownership for the set of people who live in California today if house prices had risen more slowly than they had? If they'd risen at the same pace as incomes, the decline in homeownership would have been 43% smaller. And another 600-some thousand people would have been able to be homeowners or to afford to buy a home in California today. If prices had risen proportionally with housing prices in the rest of the country, 48% of the decline would have been avoided, and 700-some thousand people would have been able to buy a home in California who can't today. If house prices had risen at an even slower pace in line with inflation, the entire decline in homeownership would have been avoided, and that's almost 2 million additional people who could buy a home. I'll end with a caveat and say, if house prices had risen more slowly, the set of people who live in California today would be only part of who lives here, there would be an additional number of people living here. They would, on average, probably have lower incomes than the people who did make it and stayed. And these numbers would, in fact, be lower with respect to that larger population. This exercise refers only to the people who currently live in California. I lied. This is the last slide. What can we say to summarize? Homeownership is lower across the board within virtually every group of California residents, young, old, married, unmarried, white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, no matter what, it is lower. While it's clear that some factors that aren't just housing affordability are at play, people probably are getting married later, having kids later, and that's affecting their homeownership choices. At least half, somewhat more than half of the decline in homeownership has to do with housing affordability being a greater problem today than it was 20 and 40 years ago. And with that, we are done.
Thank you for that, Issy. And just as a reminder, we did place a link in the chat. We can do it again with a link to the report where you can find all of this information there. And then we'll also make this available, this recording available after the conclusion of this conversation. And so that's a lot to unpack there, but I think the broad takeaway is that homeownership has become more rare in California across all groups, and it's gotten worse over time. So I want to quickly go around to our panel and just get a gut check of, from your professional vantage point, what do we think the explanation is for this this kind of chasm that we have found ourselves in, this gap between who should be able to afford a home and who actually can't, as Issy has walked us through. Noerena, let's start with you, and then just and then Ellen, and then Jeff. What resonated with you with what Issy walked through, and really what do we think the cause is?
Thank you, David, and thank you so much for writing this report. Thank you so much for inviting us all. I think the number one reason or culprit behind these low numbers, California having the second lowest homeownership rate in the country, is undoubtedly our housing supply prices. And when we speak about first-time home buyers, that entry-level housing or entry-level supply is the most underproduced product in the market today. We've kind of eroded the concept of that starter home in today's market. And we look at the diverse population that lives in California. We think about the fact that this is a majority minority state where communities of color tend to have lower incomes. There are a number of compounding issues that make this issue as difficult as it is today. So we can get started on talking about how difficult it is to build condos and all of that, but I know we'll get into that in a little bit later. But supply, I think is the number one reason.
Thanks, Noerena. Ellen, what do you think? How do you diagnose this?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And thank you for having us here today to have this great conversation. I have to echo the prior comments. I think the primary driver behind the challenges for housing affordability in California absolutely 100% comes down to supply. And that's been, a long-standing issue that we've seen in our real estate and capital markets. But we're even seeing issues that kind of exacerbate that supply issue. Obviously, we know that the decline in supply is contributing to rising housing prices, and now we're adding in the fact that that interest rates have doubled over the last 3 years. So, at the same time that consumer purchasing power is declining, you still have home prices on the rise, and it's really creating an untenable situation for many Californians, most particularly the first-time home buying community.
Thanks, Ellen. And Jeff, how did this land with you? It feels like there's probably a lot that jumps out as a home builder yourself. How do you see these challenges, and how did we get here?
Thank you, David, and thank you to the Terner Center for putting on this valuable seminar. I'd also like to thank Issy for that data and that paper. That's fantastic. There's a lot of things that could be called out of that information. But I would agree with the other two panelists that primarily we're in a supply crisis in California. And that's something that's been building for decades. And it's a lot of it is artificially constrained. It's based on legislative regulatory and local policies that make it really difficult to find land to build housing on. An example would be in Alameda County. Just one example is that every city has an urban growth boundary. When you establish an urban growth boundary, you automatically raise the price of land inside the boundary. And so that contributes to the the inability to create supply and the cost of producing that supply of new housing. So that's the primary issue. You can't deny economic laws. I mean, it's supply and demand, and we've got way more demand than supply.
So Jeff, sticking with you as a home builder, and the majority of ownership is in, say, the single family home space, and that's a product that I believe you specialize in and that you provide. Outside of, you mentioned the urban growth boundaries, but over time, as we've seen, the numbers that Issy laid out, the divergence between California and the rest of the country, as it seems like the supply issue has been exacerbated. But what have you seen over time that you think has driven this difficulty in actually being able to provide the specific product that your company offers?
Well, I think, the overall environment that we are operating in California is fairly been, opposed to suburban housing, if you will. In general, it's considered to be sprawl, and it usually is a derogatory term that some people speak. And but it's what most of us live in, and most of us want to live in that environment. But a lot of our regulatory, legislative, and policy direction in California has been away from sprawl or suburban housing, if you will, and in an attempt to to steer the market into denser infill product. The market doesn't really want that product. I mean, maybe 20% of buyers are interested in that type of product for a certain stage of their life. But most people are interested in their own lot, their own house, their own yard where their kids can play, where their dogs can dog, where they can live their lives. And they're driving further and further away to get that. In some cases, of course, out of state. As you know, our population has declined by over 600,000 residents in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years. I don't think that's a good thing. That probably will continue, or at least it won't go up very much. But just the whole Pandora, if you will, of issues that we deal with on the housing side make it really hard to provide single family homes, at least close in to where jobs are and where people are commuting to.
So Jeff, I want to pick up on a thread there and pose a question to Noerena. Jeff, you mentioned that the majority of the preference is for single family detached home ownership. Noerena, you've done a lot of work looking at the preferences of specifically Latino homeowners. And so one of the questions I have when we were doing this work and in this conversation here is, how aligned with the preferences of certain buyers, such as Latino home buyers, how aligned are those preferences with the state's policy priorities over the last several years when it comes to housing? A lot of the work we have seen is really looking at things like ADUs, townhomes. So maybe not specifically single family homes, but is definitely kind of more pointed towards the infill kind of idea. So Noerena, I guess, so again, my question to you is, how does our policy dynamic in California, how does that reconcile with the preferences of Latino home buyers?
Sure. And first, thank you, David. Thank you for that question. But I want to start the conversation or start my answer but by putting into context the role that Latinos play in the California housing market. If you look at some of the predictions that the Urban Institute has made, Latinos are supposed to account for 70% of new homeowners over the next, from the start of this decade to 2030. You have a state like California, and the only way that California increases its homeownership rate is understanding the weight the Latino community plays in that number. I mean, since 2013, Latinos have accounted for 76% of homeownership growth. And if we look at household formations, Latinos have accounted for 82% of household formations since 2010. So we really need to create the environment necessary for these sorts of communities to be able to access homeownership. But as we've noted it's becoming more and more inaccessible, especially if you don't rely on generational wealth. But to that matter, to the point about preference, I'm going to start by saying that I think the only way we solve our housing crisis is by creating smaller units. So we create more condos and townhomes. The time of creating entire communities of single family homes, I think, is past us. But at the same time, we look at the data. The National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals issued a report a couple of years ago that highlighted, together with data from the National Association of Home Builders, that Latinos in the country are willing to move farther away in order to be able to access that single family home. So if you ask them about lot sizes, about amenities, about, even if there's grocery stores, if there's restaurants, they still will choose a larger home, even if they have to sacrifice, or a larger lot, if they have to sacrifice all the amenities for driving 2-3 hours away from jobs at times. A lot of the times that's because Latinos tend to live in multi-generational households. Households are larger. There is, a need to there's been conversations about sharing walls and what that means. I mean, there's a whole host of issues. I do think that we need to reimagine what we think about when we think about home ownership, as we have historically thought about home ownership in this country for the past, since past 20-30 years, especially. But yes, it is, and we're seeing this, for example, in the Inland Empire. The Inland Empire actually produced the most new Latino homeowners in the entire country. So that really speaks to that notion of, affordability. It's a more affordable market, but that willingness to travel farther distances for the house. So thank you for that question, David.
That's excellent context. Thanks, Noerena. Ellen, I want to shift to you because you oversaw a program that was looking at addressing this from the financing side, the California Dream for All program. Which earlier this year had forgive me if I forget the dollar amount. You'll correct me. But it became quickly oversubscribed, right? It was, I think, just a few days, and after that, the money was gone, which tells you there was just an incredible demand for this kind of product. So tell us a little bit about that and what that experience tells us about the challenges we face with regards to homeownership.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's really important to think about the lessons that we've learned from some of the programs that we've offered and how that impacts California homeownership accessibility. So for the uninitiated out there, probably just a few of you, but the Dream for All program was a program that we launched back in March that provided up to 20% in the form of down payment assistance that came in the form of a shared appreciation loan. And that was available to low and moderate income first-time homebuyers in California. So then when the borrower goes to resell or otherwise transfer their home, they would pay back the original down payment assistance that we provided, plus a commensurate share of the appreciation in the value of their home. And David, you're absolutely right. The program was vastly oversubscribed. It was hugely popular. We committed about $300 million in available funds over a record-breaking 11-day period. So I think what that illustrates is the hurdles that today's homebuyers are really facing in terms of this trifecta of challenges that I mentioned earlier, the low inventory, pushing home prices higher, and interest rates that are increasing. So ISTE's presentation really focused on kind of home ownership over the last 2 decades. I find it really instructive to look at just what's happened in the last several years in terms of the accessibility of home ownership in California. So if you go back to March 2020, the median home price for an existing single family home in California was about $600,000. And that was affordable to a borrower that had the ability to make a down payment of 3%, which they could make using CalHFA's flagship My Home program, and a $2,500 monthly payment. So that borrower could afford a $600,000 home in California. If you fast forward to today, now that interest rates have doubled, that same borrower can only afford to purchase a home priced at $400,000. And so this is really where Dream for All kind of came in, right? Is Dream for All offered much more generous down payment assistance with deferred payments. It is a loan. I want to make that very clear. It's a loan, and the borrower will have to pay it back, but the payments are deferred. So that same borrower making a $2,500 monthly payment can now afford to purchase a home priced at $500,000. And that's the story that I think we heard a lot from our borrowers. We heard that Dream for All really helped borrowers who might have been out there in the market already, but were not successfully able to bid on homes because they just constantly were outbid in the market. So we heard that generous down payment assistance really helped tip folks over into homeownership and the ability to access homeownership. But I think we also have to acknowledge and note that currently, as of June 2023, the median sales price as reported by CAR for an existing single family home in California is well over $800,000. So I think that just really underscores the remaining challenges that our borrowers face, even with programs like Dream for All. Due to the low inventory that we're dealing with, we have not seen home prices adjust to reflect today's interest rates. And that dynamic is really going to continue to push homeownership further and further out of reach for more and more borrowers.
Thanks, Ellen. I want to just throw a general question out to the group now, because there have been a lot of efforts over the last 6 years to address not just homeownership, but also just the housing affordability issue in general in California. We did a report earlier this year that cataloged over 100 different pieces of legislation that were passed and signed into law since 2016. And so clearly the state is trying to do something, or we're definitely passing lots of bills to do this. And so my question is, are we, do we think these laws have helped so far, or will help? And specifically thinking about homeownership supply, or have we been maybe too narrowly focused on maybe a certain subset of the housing market? So I pose that to the group. Whoever wants to jump in, please do.
I'm going to jump in. I have two thoughts about that. The first is, land use policy in California kind of began deviating from the rest of the country in the late 60s, early 70s. That curbed sprawl early on, especially in the north, less so in Southern California, and gradually blanketed the ability to densify. And only now, 50 years later, are we finally in, the absolute crisis mode that's forcing us to rethink legislation. That's how long it took. We're already 5 years into these 100 laws starting to pass and steer this giant ship the other way. It's going to take, best case scenario, decades for them to bear fruit, because once legislation changes, an entire ecosystem of construction, finance, and development needs to emerge and gradually rebuild itself and then operate. And that doesn't happen in 2, 3, 4 years. That will take 10, 20, 30 years to happen. Sorry. We have a fire alarm. Sorry.
The one caveat I'll say is that the ADU legislation seemed to have a really incredible impact early on. But take your point, you see, about kind of the fact that it took decades to get to this point, and 5 years may be way too short a time frame to consider this. I think you said you had 2 points, right? Do you want to get to that?
I have 2 points. There's a fire alarm out here that I'm going to risk for another minute and then rush.
Okay.
We don't hear it, EC. We don't hear it. So we're
there might be a fire outside. I don't know.
Well, if there's a fire, yeah, we would love you to leave.
I'll try and be quick. When I look at all this legislation, I very quickly divide it into 2 types. We have been building here for the last 15 years in a pattern that I call islands of density in a sea of no growth. In other words, large 50+ unit multifamily buildings clustered around either BART stations or corridors, and everywhere else low density that may not be touched and is holier than thou. That's problematic because we're basically segregating the renter class from the owner class in ways that could have bad implications down the line. And as we're hearing here on this call, the demand calls for lower density housing in closer to the ground floor. And I think there is a separate path that's starting to form around ADUs and SB9 that involves modest densification or gentle densification of single family areas, and which provides a very different housing product. So when looking at all this legislation, important to distinguish what aids that first type of islands of density growth versus the gentle densification. The latter is more likely to offer a solution to the wants of the people and is more likely to offer product that is for sale, which is problematic in large multifamily construction because of condo defect laws. It's very important that we do both. That said, gentle densification could be awful in terms of climate impacts, and that's something to be cognizant of and something that we need to think about in terms of solutions. Similarly, it's likely to be much more costly in terms of its congestion impacts, transportation-wise, also something to think about.
So anyone else, like in how you observe the way California has addressed this from a legislative perspective over the last few years?
The short answer, have any of those laws had a significant impact on supply? No. The long answer, there are obviously a lot of reasons for that. Most of these laws have various requirements for, skilled and trained labor or prevailing wages or affordable housing, and, must meet certain density requirements and be in certain locations. And so all of those things are not helping to supply more housing for Californians because it increases the cost dramatically. Some of those things really increase the cost of providing the housing. But also, it's not the kind of housing people want to live in. And it's very expensive to build that kind of housing. There seems to be, I've heard a myth that, if we densify affordable housing, it'll be more affordable. No, it's more expensive. The more dense we go, the more cost to build the product. So that's a problem. But, since the California housing production peaked around 300,000 units in the early, I think it was 1963. And then, through the 80s, regardless, looking at recessions or whatever, we were building maybe a couple of 100,000 houses a year. And then since, then it's fallen off, obviously with the recession. I think we dropped to about 60,000 at the low of the recession. And then when Governor Newsom was elected and we talked about building 3.5 million houses during his term, we builders knew that was going to be nearly impossible. And quite frankly, we haven't moved the bar very much. We're building, I think last year we produced about 120,000 houses. It's probably going to be less this year because of the economic environment we're in right now. It's delayed projects, but none of the laws that have been passed are having a significant effect on supply because they have various requirements that make it hard to meet. And so, until we can find a way to provide more housing that people want to buy and live in, that's near their jobs, they're going to live further away. In fact, we have a VMT rule now that basically almost eliminates the ability to build suburban housing communities. That VMT is rising because people are voting with their feet and moving further out to get an affordable house. Like you mentioned, the cars median price is about $840,000 compared to where it was a few years ago at $600,000. That's statewide. In the Bay Area, it's over 1.25 million in the Bay Area. So, it's very difficult for people to afford those homes. And I think what would be interesting to see from ISI would be in his research is looking at the length of home ownership. I think the reason that the 60 to 75-year-old had the highest home ownership and varied less was simply because they've been here longer and they were able to buy a house when it was more affordable and hang on to it and trade that equity into other homes. But if you come in now and you're trying to buy a median priced home in the Bay Area, good luck. Unless you got a lot of cash from somebody or you saved or you sold a bunch of stock, which obviously is how most of this happens. It's extremely difficult.
Thanks, Jeff. Noerena, I think you want to jump in, yeah?
Yeah, so I do think that California was and is in such a mess when it comes to our housing supply crisis that I do think that a lot of the legislation that's been passed has been an incremental approach to addressing our whole host of issues that we have that prevent the building of housing of all types. I do agree that it's going to take time, but I disagree that that building more of a dense environment doesn't create affordable options. I think what's happening is that we don't have enough of I think it all depends on where it is. Land costs different in different markets. If we compare, for example, the LA market with the Inland Empire. So the LA market, we see that that condos are, so for the median condo in LA is about 616,000, sorry, 616,000, whereas a single family home is a median of 870,000. That is a significantly more affordable product. But in LA, they're only 21% of listings. If you look at the Inland Empire, for example, the price differential between a condo and a single family home is not as different. This is as of April, the median price home in the Inland Empire was a single family home was $556,000 compared to $480,000 for a condo. Now condos are only 12% of listings in the Inland Empire. I think in the urban centers, condos offer almost the only affordable option in the market. And I'm going to echo what AC said about the defect condo liability. Why, even with all of the efforts that have been done to address our housing supply crisis and zoning, why would an affordable house, why would a developer that accesses a land that's zoned for multifamily, why would they build condos when they can build renters when there is a 10-year condo defect liability? It is the largest of any state in the country. So that's why we see a lack of that entry-level affordable product in the state.
And one thing I want to add on to that too is, we had a report recently in the last year on middle income affordability, and one of the things we had found is that there wasn't a specific program that was facilitating middle income housing in certain cities. It is actually that cities were explicitly zoning for smaller homeownership opportunities. So creating small lot subdivisions and plans to still build homeownership, but just at a smaller scale, so that they can be offered at more naturally affordable or attainable rates. So I feel like that's has to be part of this puzzle too. But Ellen, I want to give you a chance to jump in as well. I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, well, David, you alluded to the point I wanted to make a little bit earlier, but I do think a great example of legislative interventions working is in the ADU space. There were a number of legislative interventions that were really designed to ease the land use and regulatory burden associated with building an ADU. And we saw ADU production absolutely take off in the state of California. HCD has done some really fantastic work in terms of tracking the volume and location of ADU production throughout the state, as well as helping to implement a lot of these regulatory relief packages that have really stimulated a lot of ADU production. And that really paved the way for us at CalHFA to operate the ADU grant program that we operated last year, where we provided a grant for up to $40,000 to defray some of the pre-development costs associated with an ADU construction. So I do think that helps to really sort of underscore the ways in which the entire ecosystem needs to work together, both on sort of the land use and policy side and the financing side, in order to create these opportunities for, at least in the case of ADUs, not only more production, but also the ability for low and moderate income homeowners to produce an income generating asset that makes homeownership more sustainable for them.
And if I can add, David, to this, Ellen, to your comment on the scale that we're seeing with ADU production, One of the drivers of building homes is all of the tacked on fees, not only the land, it's the approval process, it's the delays. I mean, Jeff, you can, talk to us all about how difficult it is. I think some of the various legislation and that have passed around facilitating the building of EDUs that have made it streamlined, that have made it easier to build at lower cost without subsidies, have really created scale. And it's a really exciting bill that's currently being debated by Assemblymember Ting, has a legislation that will remove the prohibition from converting EDUs into condos. If you think about the lower costs to build an EDU as compared to other products, you're looking at possibly a revolutionary way that we could provide that entry-level housing supply product for first-time home buyers in California. So we're paying very close attention on what's going to happen to that bill, but I think there's promise there.
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of legislative changes that can facilitate these smaller scale homeownership opportunities, building off of the progress that the state has already made through things like ADUs, like Senate Bill 9. That they're definitely moving in the right direction. I want to get to some questions from the audience, so we have roughly 10 minutes. I have one for you, Ellen. I want to start with you at least. And so the question is, how should the state consider trade-offs between down payment only type of assistance like California Dream for All versus construction funding converting into down payment assistance like the Cal Home Grant?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing, whenever I talk about down payment assistance, I tend to really be a broken record on this point. So I apologize to those who've heard me say it before, but the down payment assistance that we at CalHFA can offer is really only as good as the inventory of homes out there that are affordable for our borrowers to purchase. So I think this is definitely, it's cliche, but I do think this is sort of a both and moment. We have to be thinking about how can we stimulate supply and how can we create interventions in the market that create access to affordable supply for our entry-level first-time home buyers, while also providing a leg up for those entry-level home buyers. And so I think it's again something where we have to take an approach that looks at the entire ecosystem and the entire real estate market and capital and financing markets to come up with solutions that meet the various needs for various prospective homeowners out there.
Thanks for that. Next question. This is for anyone. How do you expect challenges or maybe the changes in homeowners insurance availability to impact homeownership California going forward? And there was some big news this year when a couple major insurers decided to pull out of California altogether. Are you seeing impacts of this in your day-to-day work? And what can be, do we have any ideas of how impactful that will be over the long run in terms of this homeownership challenge?
Insurance issues is a tremendous issue for the industry and for the state right now. And it's primarily a policy and regulatory issue. There's plenty of insurers out there who are willing to insure Californians, but as you know, they've experienced incredible losses over the last 5 years or so with fires and whatnot. And they're operating in a regulatory environment which has not allowed them to basically operate a profitable business in California. They haven't gotten the rate increases they've requested, and there's a lot of issues there. I won't go into it, but it's a huge problem, and we're working on it with the Department of Insurance, and we have a legislative solution that we're working on at CBIA. So we think this will get resolved, but it's still on the edge, and it's affecting a lot of Californians who already own homes and businesses, especially the condo product. The condo product, that's where it started. And there are projects that have basically been shut down because they haven't been able to proceed without insurance, and the rates that people have paid have gone up 10 times.
So I want to, this brings up a question that I hear a lot, and that is a conversation or part of a conversation on various bills in California, is the question of building in high fire severity zones. I mean, this is obviously a very topical issue that we're dealing with, and it's when we have tragedies like we have seen in the state, it kind of makes sense that maybe we shouldn't be building in these areas. Well, then you have these conversations in legislation where there's language that would say exempt, certain areas from, say, certain incentives because they're in high fire severity zones. I guess the question is, how do we balance that? And how far have we come as far as being able to build homes that can withstand fires? How do we balance that kind of improvement in construction technologies and the abilities to protect new homes in mountainous areas with the very real danger and reality we have in California with kind of an annual fire season now.
So most of the catastrophic losses from fires in California have been areas where mostly the homes are quite older than newer housing stock. So it's been older homes that have burned mostly. I mean, you go back to look at the Oakland Hills fire. I mean, they're the classic example of houses built, in the 50s and 40s. And if you look at Paradise, most of those homes were older homes. Our newer homes, the technology, home building material and technology changes all the time, and it's changed dramatically over the last 50 years. And all of our homes are sprinkled now, and our planned communities are basically designed to include all of the things that need to be dealt with from a fire safety and fire fighting standpoint. I mean, we have all kinds of rules regarding access. We have buffers. We have escape routes. I mean, new modern planned communities are designed with those things in mind, and so those are the communities that have not suffered significant catastrophic loss from fire. And so we would argue that well-planned communities can be built in fire severity zones, maybe not the highest, it kind of depends. One of the reasons we have high fire severity zones is we haven't managed our forest land, frankly. And so that I think that we can deal with that with modern construction techniques and master planned communities.
Thanks, Jeff. We have time for just a couple more. I've seen a couple in here about, how concerned should we be about other parties in the homeownership market? So namely, quote, investors that are, potentially buying up higher shares of homes than they have in the past. We see a lot of stories about this. We hear a lot about this on the policy side. So my question to the group is, in your professional experience, is this something that is really tilting the scales that significantly? And if that is true, are there ways to address this, or are we better served thinking about other solutions and other strategies?
So I think it's a problem that we see in some markets more than others. I think there are more affordable markets to see this so. For example, in the studying this issue nationally, there were areas in Georgia and areas in North Carolina where you're seeing this disproportionately, just the institutional investors coming and sweeping up for single family homes that should have been that entry level housing option for individuals and converting them to rentals. That is it's alarming, especially if you look at the number of properties that were being swept from the market when we're already not building the owner product. Plus, you tack on the interest rates that Ellen was talking about, and affordability goes down, and then you have that added activity in the market. Makes everything just much more compounded and inaccessible. I do think from the numbers, from preliminary research that we've done, and David, you and I are about to embark in more research on that issue, but most of the investor activity that happens is mom and pop investors. Actually, it is individuals that are buying up to 10 units or 2 or 3. I think about for example, my parents were able to buy their first property back in 1980 for $70,000. So they were able to move up and get a new property, the property that we grew up in, and that the other house became an investment property. That's the majority of the activity that we see in California. But this is something that is that requires more research to really understand if this is disproportionately impacting communities of color, previously redlined neighborhoods, how much this is further weighing down homeownership rates for communities of color, especially given where it's occurring. I think it's the location that is the most alarming. So more research to come on this issue, something to look for. But I think the size of the investor is a critical, if there is any sort of policy approach to that issue, the size of the investor is a critical differential that should be considered.
Thanks, Noerena. We have just a couple minutes left, and so I just want to do a very quick last question, and I'm glad it was posed because it feels wrong to talk about homeownership in California with not talking about Prop 13. So we did have a question about that, and I guess my broader question to the group is, with all the legislative changes and everything we've discussed here are really just kind of, nibbling at the edges of what the real problem is, and how do we think Prop 13 has played a role in all of this?
Well, if you've looked at this over a long period, which I've been doing this for a while, and looked at the issues, most of the land use, misallocation, if you will, in California, a lot of it you can contribute directly back to Prop 13, because that changed the game for how cities allocated their land for what uses generated the most tax revenue for them, be it retail, office, or whatever. Home ownership, housing is not seen as a positive net generator of income for cities because Prop 13 restricts the income, and most cities will tell you, well, I can't manage my budget to 2% over 30 years. It's like, they'll tell you, oh yeah, today your $1.5 million house generates a surplus, but 30 years from now, it'll probably be negative. And so that's a problem. And there have to be solutions that ultimately that has to be addressed, I believe, in the land use arena if we're going to produce more housing.
Thanks, Jeff. Alan, very quickly, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Jeff had to say, that there are any number of challenges that we face in sort of the land use economics and real estate market arena that can be traced back to Prop 13. And so thinking about how we navigate those post Prop 13 challenges has to be part of the conversation.
So that was an excellent, concise last question that just gets us in under the hour. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today to have this conversation. I'm sure we could talk for another hour or two. I thank everyone for joining us today, and to thank Issy as well for his presentation earlier and providing us all of that really outstanding data and information to inform this conversation. Again, we will have the recording available on our website in the weeks to come. And you can visit our website to see the paper. We had a link in the chat. And so again, just want to thank everyone for their time this afternoon, and look forward to staying connected. So thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.